It was 50 years ago today that Turkish forces invaded the island of Cyprus. Canadian peacekeepers were among those caught in the crossfire. CBC's Evan Dyer looks back on that historic moment and Canada's involvement in keeping the warring Turkish and Greek sides apart for decades.
It's 50 years today since Canadian soldiers of the Airborne Regiment stationed in Cyprus saw parachutes floating out of the sky. And that was their first inkling that the Turkish army was invading Cyprus, where Canadian soldiers had already been keeping the peace for some 10 years. Not only was there an airborne assault on the morning of 20th of July, 1974, but at the same time, Canadian soldiers heard firing from Turkish Navy ships because the Turks also landed on the north coast of Cyprus in a major amphibious assault. And that was the start of over a month of fighting between the Turks and Greeks. That caused 2 deaths among the Canadian Airborne Regiment there and about 30 injured. Just 2 of the 28 Canadian soldiers who died in Cyprus during that whole 30-year peacekeeping effort. It had begun in 1964, where Canadian soldiers deployed to try to keep 2 warring ethnic communities apart, the Greek Cypriots, who wanted to unite the island with Greece, and a Turkish minority who were determined to prevent that, or if it was going to happen, at least to partition the island in order to keep their own enclave out of Greece. By 1974, things had come to a head, and an internecine sort of ethnic conflict turned into a real war where the Turkish regular army was heavily involved with tens of thousands of forces on the island. Canadians continued to be there for another 20 years after the Green Line, the line of separation between the 2 sides, more or less stabilized. And over time, this conflict did become somewhat less violent, although it continued to demand a lot of diplomacy from Canadian soldiers, trying to keep those 2 sides apart. John Boileau was a captain with Lord Strathcona's, a regiment that he eventually went on to command. And when he was stationed in Cyprus, provocations across the Green Line, separating those 2 communities, were a constant.
Incidents could range from the sublime to the ridiculous. For example, one side might yell at the other side, or throw a stick, or throw a stone, or brandish a weapon, or fire shots in the air. What both sides tried to do, Evan, all the time was continuously advance their line a little bit, to try to make an incursion into the other side, to say, oh, this has always been our territory.
By the 1990s, Canadians had been in Cyprus for close to 30 years, and about 30,000 Canadian soldiers had gone through there, mostly on 6-month tours of duty. And there were questions because no political settlement had been reached. In fact, the Cypriot economy had come to depend quite heavily on the presence of UN peacekeepers. And there were new peacekeeping demands around the world in hotter conflicts, like, for example, the civil war that was then occurring in the former Yugoslavia, first in Croatia and Bosnia. And so in 1993, Canadians decided they'd had enough.
After all those years, 1964 to 1993, no progress had been made on resolving the issue. And we often felt there was a vested interest on both sides not to resolve the issue.
That marked the end of Cyprus as a battalion-sized mission for the Canadian forces. There is still some slight involvement on the island. There is 1 Canadian soldier there today, but nothing like the hundreds that used to be there. Many of the people who served there are now retiring, but this anniversary of that Turkish invasion of Cyprus on the 20th of July, 1974 is being marked today by many former Canadian soldiers, many veterans who had their formative experiences on that island. Evan Dyer, CBC News, Ottawa.